This is a boring old power supply, right? Wrong. Corsair is like, you know what? Let's just shift the way we're building power supplies these days. Yeah, I know. What's the matter? Oh.
How is anyone supposed to manage these cables?
Yeah, this is pretty bad. But I'm gonna assume you haven't heard the news.
What news?
Corsair has something completely new coming.
Dude.
Okay, so this is the new Shift Series power supply, the RM Shift Series power supply from Corsair. Power supply videos are boring for the most part, and they require specialized equipment to test things like their ripple and their 12 volt rail capacity and all that sort of stuff, and I can't do that. But this power supply is a completely redesign in the way of thinking on how power supply cables should work. So that's what we're gonna focus on today. And also too, no, this is not a sponsored video. We went and bought it today because I wanted to talk about this. So here's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna kind of go through what the specs say anyway. That I believe they have an 850, a 1000, and a 1200 watt currently. This one is the 1200 watts. Don't know why I got the 1200 watt when I could have saved some money and got the 850 watt, but this was $296. It's an expensive power supply. But it is 80, oh, it's only 80 plus gold for that price? Okay, anyway. It is a PCIe 5.0/ATX3 power supply. So it will have your standard 6+ 2-pin PCI Express cables, as well as the integrated 12 volt high power cable that you would use for 40 series graphics cards. Side note, that 12 volt power cable will not work with 30 series plugs for Founders Edition because they don't have the 4-pin sideband. I've had a lot of people asking me, can I just take a cable mod, 90-degree adapter, etc., and use it with my 30 series? No, because it doesn't have the 4-pin sideband connector built in there. Maximum combined wattages here is a total of 1200 watts. Anyway, we can just show you a shot of the back if you want to talk about the specs. But for the most part, this would be more than enough power supply for pretty much any system you could build today, even if it has like an RTX 4090 in there. The reason why they call it Shift is the cables are not in the back of the power supply that feed into the main compartment in a case. They are on the side, which when I was doing a build a few weeks back, I almost grabbed this power supply when I was at Micro Center, but then I changed my mind because I wasn't sure if the case that I was using was going to work with this, because they haven't, well, the cables are smaller, first of all. So if I compare it to one of the older power supplies, you can see the plugs are physically bigger on the older power supply versus the new one. And I think the reason for that is the plugs overall had to be smaller to allow for a tighter 90-degree bend. Because the idea here is that if you put your power supply in your case how you normally would, with, you know, the fan down like this, that this is gonna allow you to more easily route your cables to where they need to go, instead of going like down and around and back and then making this crazy bend into where the plugs would typically be right here. But my concern is, different cases have a lot of different design in either shrouded power supply compartments or up top, or cases aren't ready for this yet for the most part because of the fact that they are designed with a traditional layout of the plugs coming out the back like this. So they give you a lot of room right behind the power supply and maybe not a lot of room next to it. The width of your case is also heavily gonna matter when it comes to how much room you have to make these cables. And again, is there a solid plate right here where there's a solid panel and then maybe there's an opening here? If there's a solid panel, how much room do you have? Another thing to consider too is the fact that you are gonna be forced to, no matter what, have the fan facing down. Now, not all cases can you face it down. It depends. Some cases are actually solid right there, and they intend with the gap up top to pull air from the main part of the system to help exhaust air. So if you had to flip it over, these are now facing the side that would be like the tempered glass side panel or the main panel, which is not gonna work in just about any case. So you are now forced to have the fan down. So if you're considering this power supply, the things you have to consider now are gonna be, is there room for the power supply cables to exit the compartment that the power supply is residing in? And then is the fan gonna be able to face down? So these are some things that have to be considered. Another thing I wanna mention too, we learned this when we looked at the power supplies when we were at Micro Center a few weeks back. The 12 volt high power sideband pins on there are basically what tell the graphics card how much power is available to it. The 850 watt only has a 450, I say only, but it has a 450 watt power limit available to it. So what that means, if you're running like a 4090, you're gonna see your power limit slider is gonna be locked to 0, regardless of whether or not the card BIOS allows for it to go farther. You would have to get the 1000 or the 1200 to get the full 600 watt. It does say on the box what the actual limit is for the sideband 12 volt high power availability, limit to the graphics card. So keep that in mind. As of right now, at least the time I'm making this video, the 850 is locked to 450 watts. What we're gonna do today is we are going to take a look at the plugs. These are them right here. And then we've got 4 different case types that we're gonna take a look at to see, and they're four different kind of cases with different kinds of power supply shroud implementations to see if this is going to interfere with just a traditional type of build that you might try and work in. So for the last several generations of power supply from Corsair, they've been Type 4 connectors. These are Type 5 connectors, and they say it right on the side. I've always appreciated the fact that Corsair will put what type connector it is on the side, because you can easily reference, like, is this a Corsair Type 4? That way you know you're not blowing anything up. Look at the difference in size between the power supply side and the 24 pin side that goes into the motherboard. I'm wondering how long it is now until the motherboards and connections on the motherboard standard shrink as well, like they did on the power or for the graphics card, because this would obviously be less intrusive. It is a little bit smaller gauge wire though than say the older power supply. So that's going to be up to Corsair to make sure that they're using enough strand to be able to handle the amount of amps and stuff. It says 20 amp, it's 20 amp power capability, at least of the power supply, whether obviously the power cables have to be able to withstand that as well. But you get your 24 pin. This is a CPU. You get, here's your, this kind of stinks. What they basically did here was they took their same cable that you would be able to buy separately that basically terminates into the standard PCI Express cable that you would find in the back of their normal power supplies, and then basically we just put the different ends on there to match the new Type 5 connector. But you see how this is more of a matte, like rubbery sleeve on there, and then the ones that come with the power supply are glossy. If I paid 300 bucks for a power supply Corsair, which I did, I would absolutely expect this to match the rest of the cables. I mean, sleeve cables already would have been awesome. They're not, they are individual cable at least, but they need to match. I think this was a supply thing where they basically went, we have a ton of these already, let's pin them out for the Type 5 and call it a day. So that doesn't match, unfortunately. So what we get for connections are 2 CPU 8-pin, which can be separated into a 4-pin. So if you have an 8-pin and a 4-pin motherboard, you get 2 of those, our 24-pin, our 12-volt high power plug. We get 1, 2, 3 PCI Express 6+2 that are pigtailed. So technically we have, 6 connectors on here, but we get 3 non-pigtail. This is awesome because if you're running a graphics card that has, like, let's say you're running an older 30 series, or not 30, well, yeah, custom 30 series, 20 series that use 3 of the 8-pin PCI Express, you can have these individually running to them without having to have the pigtail on there. That's more of an aesthetic thing. There might be a little bit of performance degradation, like 1% or 2, all within the margin of error by running a pigtail off of one cable. It's really negligible. This is just easier to run and have them look clean without having the pigtails on there. But with that, I'm gonna go ahead and plug in just the CPU power, because I wanna see how tight of a bend. The smaller gauge wire and the more delicate pins in here really have me worried about putting too much of a bend on there. So without like cranking it down, I don't know, that's probably about maybe 20 millimeters between where the radius is and the plug. So you'd have to have at least that much room on the side of your power supply and any shroud or anything in the way before that becomes a problem. The idea with this is they believe that it's gonna be easier to plug things in, put the power supply in, plug things in, or maintenance it or whatever. The problem is if you have anything in the way, you cable manage and stuff, if you need to access these cables and you have to unplug it and like pull it out, you're gonna have to uncable manage to get your slack to be able to pull it out far enough to unplug these if it's not accessible. And if it comes in through the backside and not in through the side or through the front, this could end up being a godsend in terms of cable management and ease of access, or a nightmare. So it's nice to see companies thinking forward and like, how can how can we get out of the normal box that things are designed within and make them different? We're gonna see now in the couple of cases that we're gonna try here, 4 different types on whether or not it makes it better or worse. Okay, so first things first, this is the O11 Dynamic Evo. It's very similar to the standard O11. It's a Lee & Lee case. So this is everything we've got to work with here. Here's our cable management stuff. This is like a little shroud, or not shroud, but a support for the power supply. So if we look at a standard size power supply and the fan has to face this way, if you face the fan that way, it's gonna be against here and not get any solid airflow. So it has to face this way. It has to enter from the case, not through the back. So you can see with the plugs right here, it makes a lot of sense for it to have the plugs back here because then they can route right to the chambers and have plenty of room. So that in itself is not a problem. So I have my cables plugged in and I want to show you something here. They have a row of cables that are faced like kind of like oriented long ways with the power supply. And then we have an entire group of cables here, as you can see, that are oriented 90-degree perpendicular or offset to that. So this allows us to be able to bend the cables this way nicely, whereas if we knew the cables had to go up or something, we could potentially move a cable like over here, and then it could route up or down, whichever. So I chose to put everything in the front right here, which does tend to start to get a little bit thick and kind of jumbled up of wires through there, but then that'll be in the way of the hard drives. So we would really be kind of blocking off our hard drive cables there. I don't think it's any more convenient to work on than say this being in the back. If anything, I would probably say this is a little bit less convenient to work on because if the cables are right here, I still had a chance of unplugging some. But if I needed to access these cables, I'd have to make sure during the build that I leave a fair amount of slack on them and hope they're long enough at that point. That way, if I had to go and take it out, I'd be able to kind of like smoosh it in there and then get it out like that. The other thing too is I could technically, if I wanted to, swap the position of the power supply, in this case to the top, and move the hard drive cage to the bottom. So then we'll have this space up here to work with. But now we're dealing with a lot of excess, like the PCI Express, or the CPU power is right here. So now we have all this extra CPU cable that we'd have to like bundle up or something, which is gonna start to fill this area up quite a bit. So I'll just call this one sort of a neutral opinion on how well it would work in this case. One thing I want to point out though is having to kind of like push it in there as hard as I did, this wire is getting pinched. Not a lot, but there's enough because it's having to push against this piece that would be sort of a problem in terms of making sure like, hey, if that makes its way through the insulation and touches, you know, the metal, that's gonna be a problem. So before I move on to another case, I'm gonna go ahead and take this piece out and I wanna see how much more room we get. Now this only works with this case because modularity, right? If yours didn't have something like that could come out. See, now look at this. Now I've got plenty of room in there and I'm not worried about those cables hitting anything. So I'd still be able to like utilize some of the space right here to sort of make like a little S-bend. And then they can all still be kind of contained in their cable management cubby, if you will. All right, that's just one. Let's move on now to maybe a little bit smaller case without an awkward arrangement like this. NZXT's Build is a quick and easy way to get a new gaming computer. Build a gaming PC on your budget using the built-in configurator and see exactly how your favorite games will perform. Don't want to spec it yourself? Then choose from BLD's pre-configured player PC systems designed to fit your needs and budget. To see the full lineup and specs of the NZXT BLD Player Series pre-built PCs, follow the sponsored link in the description below. So this next tower here, this is the NZXT H7 Elite, which is, you know, it's a mid-tower case. You can see the power supply has to enter from the inside, and there's no shroud right here. So there is a shroud on the other side, which means I guess technically if you wanted to run it fan up, you could. As you can see, there's enough room to do that if you had to run it fan up. You don't have to in here, but I don't know if having the cables be that far away. See, there becomes your problem where you become pretty restricted on, like, that cable isn't gonna reach the CPU. So I would have had to move those as far away on the power supply plugs as I could. But if I go face down, this is kind of where the power supply was intended to sort of show its benefit. Because look at this, look how easily I can access these plugs, they're plugging it in. If they're too close together, Corsair, for fat fingers like mine to get to the little release tabs. I just want to point that out. So this is actually fairly convenient once it's screwed in, which would be right there. You can see now the visualization when Corsair was like, hey, let's do something different with our power supplies. Somebody somewhere in their product development was like building a computer and they're like, oh, why aren't the plugs on the side? Light bulb, you know. Now let's say, okay, we got our CPU plug. Now, knowing that the CPU needs to go here, instead of plugging it in here, I can just be like, let's plug this one in right here, and it'd be easier if I'd actually screwed in the power supply. So let's plug that one in there. And let's plug that one in there. So now, it really is convenient. And this is a mid-tower case, so already space is very valuable. So it's away over here, because that makes sense. Our 24 pin is plugged in there, because that makes sense. And then our SATA could literally just plug in. Could even go like under. The reason why I'm going through this level of detail in this video is like, this exists because of cable management. So I want to experience what would the cable management be like in this rig, like with this power supply. Look at that. So then you could zip tie this where it needs to go if you have your drives down there or whatever. And because the wires overall are just a little bit smaller gauge, it makes them kind of easier to fit them in these sorts of areas. So you can see how quickly I actually just got the power supply installed and the cable sort of making sense. This route right here in a traditional power supply would have to come down, across, and then make a 90 or 180 degree bend into the power supply, which oftentimes people have noticed the cable is not quite long enough for that. So they ended up coming out and doing like a diagonal run to up, and it looks ugly. So there you go. It's kind of an A+ fit in this case. So what happens if you have like a kind of goes against the grain case? Actually, initially I thought this wasn't gonna work in this case very well, but I think it actually will work quite well now that I think about it. This is the Fractal Torrent. In fact, this initially was one I was gonna say, I'm not sure it's gonna work well because of the fact that I thought it was solid right here. If anything, I remember building in this case before. It sort of sucked because of the fact that if your power supply was too long, you didn't have enough room with this sort of like a slope right here to get all your cables to fit if you had a long power supply. So, but you can see when it's centered on here, there's not a lot of room between here and this rail. So this is gonna be our concern right here. So I'm gonna take my RM1200 and I'm gonna just sort of drop it down in there, route the cables through here and see. Once it's in there, I may not have access to some of the plugs. Oh yeah, that's awkward. So once they're in there, it works, but I'm not gonna be able to get those plugs out. So I would just have to make sure I left enough slack to be able to slide it back up and then kind of tilt it up like that. I don't like when cables are rubbing against metal. This is roundish. The bottom feels like it has an edge, the top is round. So if you're going up and down and up and down, you start shaving away some of the insulation, that could be a problem. However, this case I thought it would not work in very well. Is indeed working. And again, not a terrible idea, especially in this case, because now as I have everything kind of farting around up here, it can come right out the side. Now we're gonna have a lot of excess, right? When it's up top like this, close to the power for the CPU, you have a lot of excess, but it, you know, you'd be able to just sort of do this, I guess. Maybe zip tie it together like that. Oh, look at this, there's already shavings. I'm not sure if that's just from dropping it down in there right now. There's shavings on that, you see that? Yeah. That might have been right now from just me getting it down in there because of the fact that, like I said, the inside edge there is not the smoothest. Anyway, if you were to be very careful, then you could just kind of like zip tie that together like that. And then you could kind of hide it away like that. So that's not a terrible problem to have right there. These 3.5-inch drive cages aren't a concern to me. I don't run 3.5-inch drives, mechanical drives. If you are, you might want to consider the fact that these might be sitting on top of them like that. You're gonna have to flatten these down because if you look long ways like this, you don't have a ton of room between the side panel. So if they're sitting like this, that's a problem. You would need to rotate these and have them be as flat as they can be against the side panel. But again, I thought this case was gonna be it's not gonna fit because of this. And I think it's just, Jay, you're dumb, because it's gonna work just fine. Only issue, like I said, is this particular case, it shaved the insulation just a little bit. I'm not sure how thick the insulation is, so I wanna make sure that I'm not, if I had exposed wires right now, I'd be like, okay, I need a new cable. That one's not usable safely. All right, so there we go, the Fractal Torrent. A different approach to power supply compartments. One that I thought was gonna lead to a problem. It worked just fine. So that's a bonus, with the exception of the cable sleeving. All right, careful with sharp edges, and that's true for any power supply, by the way. So this is the ROG Helios case, and as you can see already, there is a problem. The problem is there is no access to the wires from the side. It is not unreasonable to think that somebody would spend $400 or $500 on a case like this and $300 on a Corsair power supply and say, uh-oh, because look at the way this one's designed. All my cables, there is a power supply in here right now. This is the Thor, I think it is. So you can see it is shrouded on this side and technically not really shrouded on the other side because it's got that temperature readout. So it does have a window technically. I don't think it would be impossible in here. The convenience factor of this neat layout is lost at this point. So if you were gonna build in this case, this was a high-end build, so has lots of wires going to it. If you were gonna build in this case, you would not even be able to pass this power supply through the hole for obvious reasons. And once it's in, you wouldn't be able to plug it in for obvious reasons. So you'd kind of have to do this. You'd have to take it, have all your connections on there, mount it down like that, put an incredible amount of stress on the side cables right there, push it through, attach your connector, or your little shroud piece, and then screw the shroud piece down. In fact, I can't even get it straight. There we go. So it'd be like that, but you have now lost all benefit as to the reason why you would get this power supply. This is an edge case, and what I mean is, this is a very specific scenario, which I had to go looking through my cases out in the studio warehouse to go, can I find one that would be a problem? And yes, I found one, but it was a high-end obscure case that was 100% intended for the cables to come out the backside, like this, as you can see. Does that make the shift a bad idea? No, it just means in this particular build, it would be terrible because you would have zero access to the wires. And given the fact that this particular chassis with ROG's own power supply, the CPU connector having to come out here was not long enough to go neatly across and up and into the hole way up here for the power supply, or for the CPU. So it came straight diagonal across and into the hole. So now that my CPU connectors are back here, you can guarantee they're not gonna reach cleanly. They don't reach at all. So, all right, so I found one that was like, Jay, this is a bad idea with this power supply, but I don't think that's enough to make this power supply like a no-go for anybody. In fact, I even have right down there the 5000T power supply on the floor, or a case on the floor, which I was gonna use, but I was like, that's dumb. That's a Corsair case. Of course it's going to work. And yes, it looks exactly like, the layout is very similar to how the NZXT case was, where the power supply is open on the side, you got your channels and stuff. It's gonna be a beautiful build by using the shift in there. So there you go. A very unique and interesting way to move the connectors. The connectors have been shrunk. Time will tell whether or not these connectors can withstand a heavy bend or a few of them when building in them, because power supplies get reused in people's builds all the time. They'll move along with upgrades until the cables are either no longer compatible or the wattage is no longer compatible with your build. So as long as those can withstand all the flopping around and bending over the years, I'm really happy with the way this was designed, the way the plugs are laid out, the way you have angled options, and you can move it along the side to get it optimal to where your build makes sense. So anyway, there you go, the Shift power supply. Not something I would normally do a quote unquote video about, but I thought it was just unique enough to want to go ahead and talk about it. Not to mention I've gotten no less than 3 emails this week alone of people specifically asking me if this sideways layout is going to work in traditional cases. So I had to kind of test it for myself. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I'll put a link to Corsair's website. We can check it out down below. Like I said, I bought this power supply, so maybe if you guys felt inclined to give this video a thumbs up, I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one.